This is a special presentation from the Brighton Central School District.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation, this community town hall regarding the sale of Brookside. We're glad that you could participate in this conversation. Just to give you a sense for what the evening will entail and what our plan is for this evening, we'd like to first start out by reviewing the process and the origination of this opportunity, then review the current list of frequently asked questions and discuss the considerations and the analysis and what we thought about as a group, what the Board of Education considered. And then at 7:30 or so, open up the floor for follow-ups and discussion. I'm going to ask that you please put your name and address in the chat to be called on for this question and answer portion. And then I'll turn to Dan Goldman and ask him who's up first. He'll keep track of a list and we'll take in order of the chat after we've gone through the frequently asked questions, hopefully answering some of those for you. But then Dan will call your name and just simply ask you to unmute yourself and go ahead and jump right in. I'd like to ask that we wait until that portion before we do Q&A, because we may be able to answer many of your questions at the beginning as well. We will be publishing the FAQ document and sending these slides out as well, along with the recording of the meeting. And we're also being broadcast on Facebook Live, so just so that you're aware that it is being recorded. We'll add some clarifications after tonight too. I'm sure there will be additional questions that come up or things that we haven't thought about that we're happy to clarify. And I'd like to thank several people for joining us tonight. Dan Goldman, our communications coordinator, several board members. I did see Mark Kokanovich's name, and I know there are several more board members as well, but I haven't checked back at the participants in a few minutes. I saw Karen Hatch also, and I'm bound to leave somebody out, so I apologize, but I know the vast majority of the board will be here at some point. I see Julian Gilbert also on the list, and Lou Limo, our Assistant Superintendent for Administration, and Board Member Larry Davis, who I have given the title of our board Evans Farm expert. So certainly for this occasion as well, as an Evans Farm resident. And I'm going to ask Larry to, after I finish walking through the slides, clarify anything else that he may have heard from his neighbors and friends, from people in the neighborhood that he'd like to point out also. So with that, let me jump right into explaining how we got to this point, how it all kind of came about. First of all, it's important to point out that Brookside was studied, as many of you know, for a K2 remodel prior to the 2017 capital project vote. And that came about because of two committees that were taking a look at, really three committees, subcommittees, taking a look at full-day kindergarten, one of which was the capital or the facilities committee. And that group recommended that we take a strong look at Brookside to really start over with a K2 early childhood campus and kind of reimagine what things would look like at the primary level if we were going to add full-day kindergarten. And we knew at the time we needed to add space. We didn't have the space at Council Rock to have full-day kindergarten, but really wanted to exhaust all options and take a look at whether Brookside made sense. And the reality was, after almost a year-long study of that and engagement with the community, we had several listening sessions. Many people came and offered feedback. We decided that we would move in the direction of Council Rock for a couple of different reasons. One, the remodel of Brookside was cost prohibitive. And two, the vast majority of the feedback from the Evans Farm neighborhood was that at that time, adding that was perhaps not preferable, and didn't seem like a building of that size and the construction that would be required would be something that people would like. It would increase traffic significantly, et cetera. Now you might wonder, this particular purchaser is a school, and how does that compare? I would say to you, we're talking about a very, very small school, a small student population, very little traffic relative to what we would be talking about if we were thinking in the neighborhood of 900 students at a primary building and all the traffic that we see around Council Rock. So again, at that time, it was determined that that building, it wouldn't make sense. Also, financially, it was very, very cost prohibitive to do that remodel. The way aid works, the way that new construction would work, made much more sense to build at Council Rock. But we took a long view of that at the same time. And what I mean by that is we built Council Rock in such a way that it can be added onto. So the first floor addition can also hold a second floor addition. And that was a construction decision we had to make along the way. So the foundation was built in such a way that there could be a second floor. So in other words, we made that property as versatile as we possibly could, thinking about the long view and what we might need should any of the dynamics in the district change. We haven't seen significant enrollment changes. In fact, we're one of the few districts that grows very slightly with small numbers, though, not big swings up, not big swings down. And so it is unlikely in all of our estimations that that would be necessary. However, we do have the flexibility at that property. As I said, cost neighborhood concerns and the cost benefit really rendered then Brookside a surplus space. And we determined that at that time that we would continue to lease to the entities that were leasing from us, but that building wouldn't be used for any real essential district services. We have some ancillary programs, and at times we've used the fields, but for the most part that wouldn't be a district facility that we would use for our purpose. And didn't have a plan for it other than it was really surplus to us and still being used, of course, by tenants. Council Rock was constructed. As I mentioned, it could accommodate as many as we need right now and perhaps going into the future. But it's important to realize that not only did we determine the building would be a surplus building for us, but it has a long-term liability factor for us as well. In other words, there are capital costs that need to be considered for upgrades to the building and just the general maintenance of the building. And there are some arrangements within our lease agreements for some cost sharing, but for the most part, the district has a significant liability on its books and costs going forward to maintain that facility that would far exceed what we would net in lease revenue as well. The current lease agreements are helpful, but they're not a long-term solution. I'll detail that in frequently asked questions. We net about $40,000 a year in revenue after expenses based on those leases. And we've been asked often, was the building marketed? No, it wasn't. We didn't have a plan to do that. Had we planned on marketing the building, that would have likely been a different kind of conversation. But frankly, an inquiry was made very unexpectedly to us beginning last summer. The question being asked, do you have properties that you'd be interested in selling? There were several inquiries, and we did not expect that was really going to happen. There are occasions when people call us unexpectedly about a lot of different opportunities, and we would not have expected at that time that this would have come to fruition, very candidly. We were surprised as that started to happen. So what did that process look like? Fall of 2020, the potential buyers walked through the building and indicated at that time informally a desire to purchase and to continue the conversation. We consulted with our school attorney about the proper procedures to make sure we were doing everything correctly. The board considered options. Again, this being a real estate transaction, it is one that can be handled in executive session for the competitive reasons you could all imagine if you've been involved, and likely you have been in any real estate transaction. So the board considered options and determined that commencing the process would be in the best financial interest of the district and could be of the best benefit to the neighborhood in the long term in terms of the type of development that we're talking about, as opposed to the potential for other buyers that could cause commercial development unfavorable to the neighborhood. So the district began at that time our own due diligence process in terms of essentially making sure that this is how we could go about it and what we had to look at. We notified the tenants at the time as well that this was a potential. These are our friends and neighbors as well, and obviously the entities involved we have close relationships and partnerships with, and we wanted to make sure that tenants could start to think about what the long-term prospects for their space use would be, and we've been hand in hand with them on that. This spring, the board took official action to render the property surplus. That's a requirement in this process, and just simply at the time then awaited the property appraisal on our end as sellers. The property appraisal was then reviewed essentially to ensure again that it was at or above the market value, which is what's required by law. This is not the appraised value, this is the market value. So that appraisal that's done by the appraisal company considers what it essentially could fetch on the market. And we are required by law to make sure that the offer considered by the board is at or above the market value. So the board then adopted the letter of intent most recently, and the process continues. I have to turn off the annotation because somebody's crossed off on the screen something. So I just ask people if they wouldn't do that, it'd be appreciated. Hold on one second while we all wait. Board adopt the letter of intent, as I mentioned, and then the process continues. So the district now is in the process as it normally would be to provide the necessary documents and complete the process like you would in any real estate transaction. In our mind, we would want to close at some point in the near future. Really putting a date on it is probably not even realistic in the sense that the process will take what the process takes, and there's no sense right now what the timing could be on that. It just continues as you've probably been involved with any type of real estate transaction. I apologize. In my effort to ask somebody not to annotate, now I can't turn my slide. So the neighborhood, some of the considerations along the way for us. Again, the neighborhood, quality of life, use of property, all things that we thought about along the way and considered relative to the offer. And as I had mentioned, there is this conversation that we've had about the potential for long-term development and the fact that we were approached by a school entity we considered as something very positive to keep that space as close to the original intent as possible. And so certainly something that was on our list. And what I mentioned to you as well, this concept of district needs, that really the property's been rendered surplus, and the community's decision in 2017 with that capital project vote to go ahead and invest significantly in Council Rock really rendered that property as an asset, but a surplus asset with a long-term liability attached to it. So this was the potential to convert that liability into an asset that could really benefit the entire community. We considered the displacement of tenants and what that would mean, and the fiduciary responsibility of the board to act in the best financial interest of the entire district as well. The decision analysis and the kinds of conversations that we were having then, again, is this in the best interest of the district? And we really believe it does convert that liability into an asset and is in the best financial interest. When considering all possibilities, could it be positive for the surrounding neighborhood? And as I've mentioned several times, really we thought, again, it would be as close to the original intent of the buildings and grounds. And it's really important for people to know too, that at this point, the potential buyers have indicated that they are not planning any major changes that would adversely impact the neighbors, and that's directly from them. A question has been asked, can the board do this? The board has an obligation actually to consider this financial opportunity, so long as, again, the sale is at or above the market value, and market value contemplates what the price would be if marketed. Could this impact other aspects of district finances? Absolutely, significantly, in fact. The funds could be used for additional capital investments or other programmatic opportunities that could reduce cost for all Brighton taxpayers, in fact. So we've talked a lot about what that could look like internally, and can't commit to a specific project. That's a longer term process of thoughtfully and carefully considering options and costs. But certainly capital investments would be high on our list. And in doing so, reducing then or eliminating any local share. If we had the opportunity to have resources in a capital reserve such as this, again, not decided yet, but this would be an option. We could leverage that to do other capital improvements and continue revitalizing the buildings across the district without a local cost. So it would cover the local cost in comparison then to the state aid. So just an example of how that could be utilized and beneficial for the entire community. So some of the frequently asked questions, and let me just stop sharing there and share a different document. Again, these will be posted for people to be able to take a look at and go through. I won't read them all at you word for word, but essentially summarize some of what's been asked of us the last few days and other considerations. Before I jump into each of those, I did mention that I wanted, as I said, his title, our resident board Evans Farm expert, Larry Davis. Anything else as a neighbor or a member of the Evans Farm neighborhood that you'd like to clarify or jump in on?
No, I think so far you're hitting everything we wanted to hit. I mean, I'm a 30-year Evans Farm resident, a lifelong Brighton resident. I've been in Evans Farm since '91. I certainly hope and want to be able to continue to use Brookside, going back to a previous message I sent through Aaron. The decision in May of 17 that said we weren't going to use Brookside, that we would instead invest in Council Rock, was sort of the tipping point. And I'm not suggesting we were living on borrowed time, but we knew at that point that it didn't serve the school district. It served the community, but it didn't serve the school district. And our core mission is about youth. It's not about being a landlord. So I don't, this is the right business decision. And I say that both as a Evans Farm resident now and hopefully long into the future, but also a school board member who has to represent the entire Brighton community. But I think there's a couple of things, Kevin, you'll cover in the FAQs that will answer a few questions.
Thanks, Larry. I appreciate it. I'll ask you too after I do those. If you want to chime in again, by all means, please clarify anything along the way. The first question that came up, communication, why wasn't this brought to our attention earlier? And I think that's a really valid question, an interesting one that people ask. And, it is contrary often to the way we try and operate in a very collaborative, open, transparent manner where we work with people to gather feedback. For example, when we discussed the development of Brookside before, it was very much about asking people how they felt. The difference in this case was simply the complexity of and the competitive nature of a real estate transaction, and the fact that we were presented with a business opportunity. And frankly, your board members are elected to act on your behalf and within the law to make particular decisions on your behalf and represent you in these kinds of conversations and discussions. And so, yes, we often have town halls and we communicate very differently, but in the nature of a competitive transaction and working with a potential buyer to secure a deal with a great financial outcome for the district, it wasn't necessarily advantageous to work through in a different manner. In this type of business decision, it was really in the best interest of everybody for the board to represent you in that conversation. This question, why wasn't the property marketed? Could it have been brought a higher offer? Again, the market value that the board is required to get for the property at or above contemplates the market value and whether or not there could be a higher offer. And at this point, that decision has certainly been made. We are not permitted as part of the privileged portion of this in the business decision to share with you that market value. That is again, part of the competitive nature of a real estate transaction and a discussion. It wouldn't be a number that you would share with a potential buyer while you were working with them trying to achieve the greatest price. But it is our estimation, knowing those numbers and those values, and again, making that decision on your behalf, that it couldn't, that this is a fair and attractive and appreciated offer for the property. What about taxes? Couldn't this property have been converted to taxable property or beneficial development of the land? First of all, it's not likely because that would have required zoning changes. And I am sure that that would not have been supported by the neighborhood and then likely the town as well. And it should be noted, really, since this process became public, which was known to many, particularly in the commercial real estate world, it wasn't a secret, we haven't been approached with different offers, additional offers, competitor people looking to challenge offers, et cetera. Clearly, nobody knew the amount until the letter of intent was released and acted on by the board. But it has not been something where we sensed that there was a significant market either. What about use of the property? Will we still be able to walk and play? Well, as mentioned, at this point, the potential buyers have indicated that they are not planning any major changes that would adversely impact the neighbors. What could be done about increased traffic? Again, the potential buyers operate a very small school with limited traffic. The Winton Road entrance will likely be used in most instances as it is now, but the continued drop off and pickup is still happening at the Montessori program, and that is expected to continue. Could it be moved to Winton? That would certainly be up to the town and the new owners to do that. I'm going to be honest with you. I wouldn't guess that that is something that is probably in the cards necessarily. I think it would be disingenuous for me to tell you that that is probably going to happen. We have not had discussions with the buyers about that, but remember, it is planned right now that the Montessori school will be there at least for some period of time. That will be between them and the new owners, and that pickup drop-off is essential in that program and having multiple means of egress. I would say again, though, we're talking about a very small school environment with likely very little traffic and the opportunity to utilize the Winton Road entrance as much as possible, I'm sure. This next question is very similar to that. Does the town or the school have the ability to legally close off or restrict that particular entrance? And certainly we could do that now, but it wouldn't benefit either the new owners or be problematic. It would be problematic for the current tenants. And then somebody asked, would that be enforceable once there's new ownership? And the answer would be no. If we were to decide that as owners right now, the new owners could certainly decide to do something different. Does the school or town have a plan to do it? No, we do not. And I'm not aware of a town plan. Currently is our property, so it wouldn't be something that the town would be doing. Can't the town buy the land and develop a community center? The town certainly could have, but we're not aware of a desire to do so. That's not something that's been communicated to us and would be a question for the town. Why did the school board decide to notify only a select group of residents regarding the sale? We didn't actually decide to notify a select group. We were responding to a question from a group of residents, which was where the original communication was coming from. The board did take the necessary actions, though, in public session along the way, as required by law as well, of regular board meetings. Was the town of Brighton offered the opportunity to purchase Brookside? Not specifically, but we've been communicating with the town on this issue from the beginning of this potential sale, and that hasn't been a discussion that's yielded, in our estimation, any interest in doing that. That, again, would be a question to ask the town as well. And I'm not trying to pass the buck. I'm just being honest with you that as much as we've talked about that as partners, as talked about this sale, the purchase of the property is not something that has been indicated as advantageous or desired by the town. What has been the net cost to the district for the Brookside School and property for each of the past 3 years? And then it goes on to elaborate on the exact amount. I will give you that. The district has profited from the lease and the rent, approximately $40,000 a year. Again, though, it's really important to remember $40,000 a year, so annually, times 100 times would be the offer on this property, right? So we're talking about a $4 million offer. And remember that although there are there's $40,000 in revenue after our costs each year, the long-term capital liability, so the repairs that we would need to make to the building ourselves as landlords, which, as Larry pointed out, we're not landlords, we're not suited to be landlords, would outweigh the current potential for profit. There's not aid on that for the school district. We wouldn't have the opportunity to do that, and to house the programs that tenants would want us to be able to accommodate would require an expense that would make it a significant liability and an annual loss to the district. We were asked, is the parcel of land of Allen's Creek part of the Brookside property? Some of the unused vacant land in the neighborhood is actually owned by the county and the state for maintenance of and control of Allen's Creek. There are other acres also contiguous to the neighborhood on the west side of Winton that are currently available for residential development. They're not owned by the district, though. Who did the assessment of the property in preparation for the sale? Why was this particular person or firm selected? It was completed by Midland Appraisal Associations. Midland was selected by our legal team. We didn't participate in the selection of the appraisal, and it was the purpose for our attorney to advise us whether the offer minimally met the market value. And again, that definition of market value is important to consider. It's defined as the most probable price which a property should bring in a competitive and open market under all conditions requisite to a fair sale, the buyer and seller each acting prudently and knowledgeably and assuming the price is not affected by undue stimulus. So in other words, it contemplates what it could fetch if it was marketed and a for sale sign was on the lawn. When do current lease agreements expire for the Montessori School, Brighton Rec, Brighton Senior Center? Are all three of these groups on annual leases or are they longer term leases? The lease with the town of Brighton is annual with a 1-year notice provision, and the last amendment was in 2002. The lease with the Montessori School of Rochester is 2018, July 1, 2018, ending June 30th, 22, and an option to extend through 2023. Although the rents supplement the cost of operating the building, the bigger issues are the long-term capital liability, as well as the fact that the Council Rock expansion, again, caused Brookside to not be a part of any of our future plans. Instead, it became a liability. And we do not receive aid on work done to the building. Long-term costs require repairs, upgrades. They far exceed resources gained based on the purchase price identified in the letter of intent. Additionally, any taxpayer dollars spent on the building takes away from other school initiatives that are actively in progress. So anything we spend there takes away from other things in the district because they're not aided. We don't generate any revenue on that spending. It's simply not financially responsible for us to keep the property, given that liability versus the potential revenue scenario that's being presented. What happens if the Talmudic Institute chooses to sell in the future? Should the community have any voice in how it is used or possibly developed? The owner of the property could certainly choose to sell, and no different than any other real estate transaction, the neighbor's voice would be limited to any change likely in the zoning requested. This is that it's a real estate transaction between two parties. So they would certainly be able to choose to do that. There'd be no restriction or covenant on their sale of the property. Can portions of the 21.8 acres be separated from the sale and donated Brighton Town so that open space and a neighborhood playground can be kept available for community use? The option hasn't been reviewed, as it would also be inequitable to the rest of the district who shares in the ownership of the resource. In other words, we would not be financially responsible if we were donating an asset to one portion of the community on behalf of all other taxpayers, right? So it is a space that belongs to everybody, and we wouldn't be able to do that. It would be essentially, in a way, a gift of public funds. Can a community meeting including representatives from the Talmudic School be held prior to a vote to allow for many specific questions how a healthy partnership can be possible? A vote's not scheduled regarding the transaction, but the prospective owners have offered to hold a public forum to listen directly to the concerns and interests of neighbors upon the purchase. At this point, they're not planning, again, any major changes that would adversely impact neighbors. Has the board considered a long-term lease to Talmudic Institute instead of a sale? This would allow for community to keep the asset in control of the valuable open space for longer-term planning. First, I would say, answering it in multiple ways. One, in terms of long-term planning, we have already assessed that that is not in our long-term plans, number one. Number two, in leasing the property right now, that doesn't change our long-term liability in terms of the property and the capital costs as a landlord, which we're not equipped to be, and it would take revenue away. And a lease arrangement would not be financially beneficial the way a purchase is in this fashion. And so that's not something that's been explored. With that, that's the last of the FAQs. Larry, was there anything you wanted to, before we open up to the chat, mention?
Yeah, this was on one of the FAQs, Kevin, and I had somebody just text me a question, actually. This is just math. The school was built in 1957. It was added on to in 61 and 64. And it was last a school used by the school district, we believe, in 1987. So it's a 64-year-old building. And it's about 22 acres. It's about 56,000 square feet. I just had a question about size and how long has it not been used by this school district in that regard. No, I think you've mostly hit the rest of it. I'll continue to say that the decision in 17 to expand Council Rock as opposed to, I'll look at Brookside, and that was seriously considered because we felt we could get Brookside ready without disruption. So that was a major decision in this whole process. And I realize it was 3 years ago, and some people on the call may not have lived in Evans Farm at that time, so they wouldn't have participated in that decision. But the decision to expand Council Rock and prepare it for additional expansion if necessary really rendered this a moot asset at that point. And, you know, the numbers that you talked about, 40,000 versus, 100 times that, are really pretty self-explanatory. I'll continue to say, and I talked to a couple folks who walked by my house a couple weeks ago. We put a small addition on our house because we're staying in Evans Farm for a while, and I hope to still have access to Brookside. But from a fiscal standpoint, in terms of serving the entire community, this is the right decision. Other than that, I'm all set, Kevin, if we want to take some questions. I don't want to take up any more time.
Kevin, if I could add one element that might be some help before we go to questions, if that's okay. Folks, Mark Kocanovich, board president, I did want to add one item. Many of the questions that we've been receiving that are in the chat tonight have to do with town programs on that property. I would just refer you to a couple of things. The town board met last night. That meeting is available on video on the townofbrighton.org website. Bill Maley, Supervisor Maley, briefly addressed Brookside at the beginning of the meeting, and he did make comment as to the town's current plan. They've engaged the services of a consultant to look at short, medium, and long-term space needs for all of the town programs that are currently housed at Brookside. So in other words, the town has known for a very long time that at some point, Brookside School may go this way. I will also, in the interest of full disclosure, tell you that I happen to be a citizen member of the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board, along with Ray Warwick from Evans Farm is also a member of that board. we have long had conversation about the use of the additional land that was purchased at Buckland Park, so that the town has got many wheels turning, if you will, many discussions in play in terms of what they wish to do ultimately with that property, with the community center, with all those types of ideas. So I would encourage you to speak to Bill, attend the next town board meeting, which we posted, and I think Council Member Robin Wilt posted June 23rd is the next town board meeting. So the point is, the town has been well aware and has been discussing future needs for town programs for a very long period of time. Those programs will be maintained. That has been discussed with the Recreation Advisory Board, and actively the group has been looking, and those programs are going to be maintained. So thank you, Kevin.
Dan, questions? People that would like to unmute themselves and ask questions?
So we have, excuse me, we have a list of written questions so far that have come in. Do you want to work through those, or just go to people that want to talk first?
Well, I'll go ahead and try and do that the best I can, and just ask people, if I don't fully answer your question, please unmute yourself and feel free to clarify it. Vicky, I see yours is first regarding the previous perhaps attempt to sell. I've been here 12 years and was not involved in that. Mark's been on the board 15, Julene quite a long time too. Do you remember? I don't think any of us were a part of that, so I'm not familiar with the community's involvement in previously, or a process that was engaged in. The only process that we were involved in was the discussion of the development of Brookside as a K2 building. And that was a broader process because it wasn't just about, it was about kindergarten, it was about whether we'd make capital investment at Council Rock, and kind of the bigger picture. It also involved borrowing a significant amount of money that requires community approval and community feedback in that process. It's just an entirely different process. So that, yes, that was different. G, to everyone, what will they be building? I don't know of any plan to be building anything. They're buying the land and the facility. So I couldn't speak to anything regarding that and have no indication. My assumption is they're prepared to use the facility. I think since this was in the chat at 7:15, I explained the perspective on community involvement. So I would just ask if Vince Hope would like to ask that again or clarify that. I'm happy to do that. I do think that was covered already.
Well, I'm just curious on, it seems that there was a very limited communication process to the entire community. And I'm just wondering if the board really discussed that and had an option and made decisions on how the communication process would work.
Yeah, so I think, and I would, welcome any board members if you want to jump in as well, but I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I would say our discussion and the way I tried to describe it before was counterintuitive to the way we typically engage, admittedly, and not nefariously, but admittedly, because you're talking about a real estate transaction, the competitive nature of that, the negotiation of a contract, the presentation of an offer from a potential buyer, and the fragility of a potential opportunity. And that doesn't always lend itself to a broad public engagement process or public conversation. So I do understand that concern. The board followed all of the legal requirements for notifications and public adoption to the letter, and consulted with our attorneys on what we were supposed to do. But there wasn't a discussion, let's keep this a secret, but it is, because it by its very nature is something discussed in executive session, again, because of the competitive nature of it, and it's a business transaction, is not allowed to be shared outside of executive session. So in other words, as a neighborhood member, Larry Davis, bound by public officer law, doesn't have the ability actually to share it outside of executive session because of the nature of the topic. Mark or Larry, do you want to elaborate on that at all?
Mark, I'll let you go first and then I'll follow because I have a couple of things to say.
I think you've just described it well, Kevin. I will say, I think that certainly in hindsight, I mean, I don't think we handled every single thing perfectly, to Vince's question and to many of the points that folks have written us about the last couple of weeks. But given how this occurred, and again, I think it's important for folks to remember, we were approached. We were not marketing the building. Once that process started and legal representation was engaged, our folks from Harris Beach, both on contractual side, real estate side, everybody, we had to follow a certain process and procedure that was confidential at that point in time. And the aspect of the property transaction, if you will, was well known within commercial real estate circles in town. And no one has approached us with another offer of any type. And we are comfortable, based on all of the professional advice, legal and otherwise, that we've received, that the offer that we are engaged in, that we've accepted at this point, but not yet executed a sale, is very competitive and in our best interest, not only of the district, but of all district taxpayers. So at what point, looking back, could we have communicated more or different? It's a very difficult thing to say because of the nature of the transaction. And I will say also that every discussion that the board has had with our leadership team and with our legal team has also centered around the best use of that property for the long haul, for the town and for the direct neighborhood. And again, Kevin mentioned this, but our feeling was this is something that would preserve the property as close to it is right now. Quite frankly, probably less traffic than there is right now on a daily basis when things get back to full normal. And, we felt that was a beneficial aspect of the process and the project.
I would just add, it's difficult to project when a possibility becomes a probability. So when someone says we're interested, I mean, we have lots of things, non-real estate things, that we're approached with the board, and someone says, what about this? Where we consider them and talk internally before we disclose because we're not sure where it's going. Again, this building hasn't been used for 34 years. And somebody comes in and makes hasn't been used as a school as part of the district in 34 years. I want to be clear on that distinction. And somebody comes forward with an offer, you go, yeah, we'll listen and sort of see how that process unfolds. So, you sort of look backward and go, I'm not sure we would have handled it any differently, not knowing all of the possible outcomes. So when someone says we're interested, you go, okay, what's your offer? And then they've got to do their work and they come to us and we sort of go through some of that stuff. So when exactly that's okay to be public can be extraordinarily difficult to determine. In my previous work life, I was in the commercial real estate, and a lot of these things are discussions, and they're discussions, and then people start to put pen to paper, and then it starts to get serious. And it's important to note sort of how something starts as a discussion and a possibility. At some point, you deem it a probability. And it's never highly predictable when's that going to happen.
I would just ask at this point, because many of the questions seem to have been answered in the chat, but they were posted prior to them being explained. So I would just ask at this point, anybody who would like to, if you just simply unmute yourself and then we can answer your question.
Kevin, I want to say thank you to you and to Larry. You guys have been really great about responding when I send a neighborhood message or contact. Larry's reached out a few times to make sure that we got the notes and that we were able to share them. And I know, Larry, your hands were tied as far as what you were able to share with us back several weeks ago before everything became public. I will say my view of the property is actually different than a school board member. So my view of the property often in my head doesn't include the building. It includes the nearly 22 acres of space. And I think about what I see when I look outside, when I see deer or fox or other animals that are around here. I see neighbors that go over and play. There's a treasured aspect to that public land space. And so most of my questions don't revolve around who's going to buy it, what's going to happen with it. It really revolves around, should we, as a community, accept a circumstance where we knowingly let a 22-acre piece of property go into private hands instead of public hands. So I think part of the angst and anxiety that I'm hearing in my own head, as well as from other neighbors, really deals with knowing that there may be an opportunity to approach the town or whatever other public entities may exist to say, hey, you should go do this. And even though there's 2 town board members sitting here, they'll both tell you they're not going to do it unless we as a community step up and say, hey, go buy this thing and keep it in a public state of existence. So I would just, the first thing I want to say is I would encourage the school board members just either allow that space to happen, or if you really don't feel like there's enough people squawking about it, I get it. But the town board meeting was last night. It's not tomorrow. It's not, the next one after this meeting isn't for another 2 weeks, and you guys will be recessed for the summer. The other concern I have about it really is ever so slightly about who will own this property. I don't know the buyers. I have heard concerns. I've heard excitement. I've heard both. I don't know what the buyers are going to look like when they're gone. They won't own it forever. So I do worry about my property when it comes time for me and Vicky to retire and leave Brighton at some point in time, whether that's to a retirement community or somewhere else. But that's 30, 40 years down the road. I don't know what that's going to look like. So part of the other reason I'd really like this to stay in a public set of hands.
The only comment I would make, Aaron, and thank you for your positive comments. And you know, this is certainly not set up or intended to be a debate or a discussion or convince people. We're just providing information, answering questions. I just want to make the comment that the potential buyers we've had a variety of relationships with over the years relative to students in our community attending that school, and had nothing but positive interactions. And I think a really, really good group of people that would be good stewards of the space and welcome neighbors. And again, that notion of it being used in alignment with the intent of the property originally, and for many years as a school, I think is ideal relative to any type of development if it's being sold or transferred.
I would also say, and this gets a little bit into the weeds, so it's a little bit dangerous, but Mark would have to help me here. 10 or 15 years ago, when the town went to public vote for a bond act to buy Buckland, the areas of Buckland that were developed, that bond, and I forget what year it was, Mark, 10 or 15 years ago, that bond pays off in 23, so 2 years from now. And so my sense is, and this is a town board discussion, they'll want to pay anything off before they decide to take on any new debt in order to purchase something. And there's more land over there. And again, I did hear Mark say that Supervisor Maley and the town board did discuss this briefly last night in terms of that. But I mean, there's a continues to be obviously a sensitivity towards any impact on taxes with any additional purchases for things like that. So again, that gets into a little bit more because I was involved with the Citizens Park Committee when my kids were playing baseball. So I'm aware of the bond act that caused that land over at Buckland to be purchased. And it wasn't a lightly held decision. It went to a vote and all those things. And we're still 2 years away from paying off that loan to pay for that land over there.
Christina, Robin, you're kind enough to be on the meeting and here, and we're talking about you right in front of you, which lends me to feel uncomfortable about that. So please feel free, if you'd like to make any comment on that, you're welcome to do so.
Hi, Kevin. I will say that as in the case of the school board discussing real estate, it would be a matter of executive session. Again, we're talking about the competitive sale of real estate. And so we're here mostly to listen to the community and garner that feedback. Thank you so much for acknowledging us in this discussion, but for us, I think this is mostly a listening session.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Would anybody else like to unmute themselves and clarify any questions or comments?
Yeah, I had a question that I threw up on the chat. The fields out there are not dry, and they've never served as good sports fields, as everybody knows. Can the board comment on your knowledge of the floodplain there, and especially as it impacts Allen's Creek, just in terms of letting this go out to some other buyer? And as Aaron has said, to a non-public owner?
Sure. Well, I feel relatively ill-equipped. I don't feel like an expert to give you the best information, Vince, but I'll answer the best I can, then ask Lou Alimo if he can jump in. He's our Assistant Superintendent for Administration. Any kind of development in areas like that, again, my understanding, because of the floodplain issue and the creek, would require significant environmental review for any type of change. And so that process, which is a very public process, and you're not just subject to that as a public entity, would have to accommodate for the floodplain and any flooding issues. Again, though, I am not privy to any knowledge that there's any development actually being contemplated, but actually use of that facility is what's been contemplated. Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, and then Lou will be able to correct me. When we looked back in 17 at the possibility of a K through 2 at Brookside, the DC is involved. There is a very well-defined floodplain that's there. It doesn't get changed because of any potential development. And to your point, Kevin, my understanding is the buyer wants to take it as is. So there's a whole bunch of, and that's my non-technical term, there's a whole bunch of rigorous study that has to take place if someone even wants to contemplate changing a wetland, a floodplain, or anything. And anybody who's walked over there after a rain knows how wet it is. It's like a sponge in a lot of places over there. So I don't know if that answers the question. Lou, you can add to it more intelligently.
Good evening, everyone. The only thing that I would add is when we were evaluating the feasibility of development of the Brookside, that was certainly contemplated. So there's some address of that in the feasibility report. And then certainly the appraisal report has excerpts that address that as well. What we can do in the follow-up document to this is I can cut and paste from those two documents. They're on, well, the feasibility report's on the website right now, but we can more specifically answer that question of what has been reviewed. We did not go through the state environmental quality review, which would be required if we were ever develop that property. But we can share what the architects engineers mentioned in the feasibility plan when we were proposing to add square footage to the property.
There's a few different questions in the chat that I just want to summarize with some more general responses, because some of them would involve discussions related to the negotiation of a sale and the transaction. But I would generally say to anybody asking regarding these types of questions that once sold, the district will not have a relationship to the property or a continuing business relationship to the property. But it is important to point out that the town controls zoning on that type of property. And if it was to be sold in the future, and I don't anticipate that would be something happening. Of course, I don't think anybody would have anticipated this conversation. It would require zoning changes that the town would have to approve for there to be the type of development that I think you're probably concerned about as a group. So that would be something certainly in terms of long-term protection for the group. If you're thinking about advocating around zoning, it can't just be sold to somebody and then turned into a shopping center, right? It's not it would require significant change for that to happen that the town would have to approve. I do want to point out, while I'm just waiting if anybody else wants to jump in, that I want to stand corrected or sit corrected that the traffic right now, I indicated, that's largely the Montessori school. That is also district staff. There is some office space there, other programs, and some of the other tenants that do come in and out of the front. So all of that traffic is not coming from the Montessori school. And to Mark's point, without the various entities that we do have in the building right now, the Montessori traffic actually is not accounting for all of that. And in all likelihood, at least in the short term, people might not see as much traffic.
Hi, can I jump in? I have a question.
Please do.
Jim Warden from Birmingham Drive. Judy in the chat asked a question about a map of the exact parcel that we're talking about, and just for the purposes of discussion, I'm wondering if you can tell us what part of the creek is included in the parcel that's being considered, what part of the woods along Winton is included and is not included.
Lou, can you speak to that?
I don't feel confident speaking to it, but I can certainly post the map, the parcel map, and the demographics that we had in the feasibility study. I could post that afterward, or I could post that tomorrow.
Great.
Generically speaking, the wooded area that's adjacent to Winton Road and the portion of the creek that runs adjacent to Winton Road, and it ends right around the wooded area before the creek bends behind Fairhill, and there's an old sort of completely decimated footbridge.
The old broken down bridge is what the kids call it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a neat place to look at, but that portion of the creek in that section on the school map actually shows that it's owned by somebody else. And then the wooded area with the creek that sits between the school building, well, between the school lot and the light industrial park by the diverging diamond, there's actually a section there that Kevin was referring to that's a separate property as well.
Yeah, I'm looking at the map right now, and it does look like there's portions that jag out past the southwest corner and the northwest corner that carve out past the creek.
The map will be a good visual aid once you're able to get it posted, Lou, because I remember when we went through it for the study in 17, there's a couple of weird sort of corners or edges that you wouldn't suspect.
Yeah, there's a parcel map in the appraisal report that I can post after this.
Kevin, can I just, I'm struggling with how to ask the question, but several people approached me privately, and I'm curious. There's concern about, I know that potential buyers are not changing anything with the property. There's concerns about any limitations in respect of observations that the buyers may follow that would prevent or maybe encourage people not to be on the property at certain times. If there's an opportunity for the buyers, if they do buy the property, to have that conversation with the neighborhood. We do have a lot of kids over here, and a lot of families move here and enjoy walking to that little tiny playground. If this does go through, it would be nice to be able to figure out how to maintain either that playground or use of that space while being respectful of whatever traditions and observations there may be.
Well, I think you asked that very well for struggling to ask it, Aaron. So thank you. But I will say this: the conversations that we've had, I would characterize three really specific ideas to take away. One, they have said that they do not plan that there would be any major change to that would affect the community, number one. Number two, they would like to have a community meeting once purchased to have exactly that kind of conversation. And three, desire to be good neighbors and to be welcomed into the community and to have a positive relationship, and have really we have felt good about that and good about the opportunity for that kind of discussion to take place.
Thank you for that. I have had a couple of neighbors offer to reach out, and if and when we get to that point, I'm happy to help facilitate or to just simply be a person in the room. So.
Gotcha. Other questions that either haven't been answered or any other comments people would like to make if we've missed anything?
When do you anticipate that the sale will be finalized?
Judy, we don't know. I think similar to most real estate transactions, it is a process. I'll give you an example. When we began the process of obtaining the market value back in the springtime, that process took a significant amount of time. So we don't have a timeline in mind.
Will it require a vote by the Board of Education before it's finalized?
I believe the board would approve the final sale by vote. Lou, can you clarify for me?
That's my understanding as well. The final
Okay.
purchase and sale agreement would be approved by the board.
Okay, thank you.
The contract would be executed by the district and the attorneys, presented to the board for deliberation and likely approval at some point in time. There was a question. It will not be at our upcoming June meeting. We are a ways away, but we don't know for how long, for specifically how long that will take, but this will not happen in time to be on an agenda for next Tuesday's board meeting.
Well, I appreciate you all setting up this meeting. What concerns me is that a large portion of the community might not have gotten the notice. And so you're just getting comments from those of us who did. And I did not hear from it via email from the district. I heard about it via email within my neighborhood because someone had received the letter because they had a child at school and emailed it out to everyone who was on the e-group. More than 50% of the people on my block never got the letter directly from the district. And I would imagine that there are probably many residents of the town, especially those who are not online, who did not get a notice about any sort of a meeting. So they're still kind of in the dark on the whole thing. So I just throw that out as a comment. If you're soliciting public input or if you're trying to get people to understand what's going on, this meeting alone is probably not sufficient to reach all of the residents.
Thank you, Judy. That's a fair point and certainly something we'll have to consider as we move forward.
Thank you.
Kevin, this is Kay Wilkoff, also from the Evans Farm neighborhood, and I appreciate your responses to my emails earlier today. I'm very impressed with your timing and appreciate all the effort it sounds like you and the board have put into this. I also appreciate just hearing more of the details, as I know being an invested community member, we have felt a little bit in the dark waiting for this more detailed information. I agree with what was said earlier by some of the participants about just feeling like the community needs more time to respond to this and be involved, especially relating to the history, knowing that the district has tried to sell this property in the past, and the overwhelming response from the community was for that not to be in their best interest. So, certainly hearing some of the things you're sharing tonight about the financial liabilities, this may be a good option for the district. One of the comments in the chat that I'm really interested in hearing more specific answer about, I think, Kevin, you touched on it a little bit more generally, was this exploring the preservation of a right of first refusal for the interested buyer. I think a lot of the neighbors who are looking at some of the impact on property value or flooding concerns with potential expansions or rezoning issues and long-term future decisions, it's kind of this idea of longer term, what happens if this next buyer chooses to sell. And so I think it would be great to know if the district is willing to explore the idea of establishing some sort of contract of right of first refusal that could put a lot of these neighbors at ease, I guess, if that makes sense, for some of the longer term complications or implications of this kind of big decision.
Okay, thanks for the positive comments. I appreciate it. And I do appreciate the emails and being able to discuss back and forth. So thanks very much. And I want to be careful to not dig too far into the detail, only because, again, given the sensitive nature of a transaction and discussing that transaction within the process with a purchaser, respectfully to the purchaser, we wouldn't negotiate in public space or necessarily discuss some of those details. However, I will say this to you. The notion of a clause that would set a price now for a property is not something, if I was the purchaser, I would agree to. In other words, you don't know what the value of the property would be at that point in time. So I wouldn't think that that would be a likelihood. I don't know the fine points of the agreement with Faith Temple for the Buckland property and the right that the town has regarding first approval, but I believe that's not at a set price, but rather at whatever the marketed or available price is that the town has that opportunity. So I don't know that a purchaser would agree to a price now, not knowing what the dynamics might be later on. That being said, any other details about that particular negotiation or that discussion are not something that I could detail at this point.
Kevin, if I could add to Kay's point and a number of folks who've made this similar points. One thing I would say to you as a 29-year resident of Brighton, an individual who's devoted a lot of time not only to the school district, but to town committee work, you live in a community with one of the most robust town boards and supervisors in terms of zoning, historic preservation, appeals of that process in the entire greater Monroe County area. And I'm very comfortable as I continue to live here that that process will protect the property moving forward. So in other words, whether it be this potential buyer or a future buyer, anything significant that would attempt to be changed would have to go through an entire approval process through the town of Brighton. And it is intensive with tremendous clarity presented and public input. And because it's a nature of that process at that point in time, separate from a real estate transaction. While I'm loath to bring this up, one need to look no further than Monroe Avenue near Clover Street right now in that project. So I do think that there is an ability that the community should feel comfortable in a couple of things. We have determined this is in the best fiscal interest of the entire community to move forward with this process. Number two, we feel very comfortable as 7 board members who all live in Brighton and are committed to this community, that this is also in the best interest of those who live nearby the school. We understand how that works. We have 5 buildings, people live near those buildings all over our community, and we work with them all the time. And we believe that this entity will continue to do that in a way that the neighborhood will be accepting of. So, I guess I would ask folks to remember that there are provisions in the town code as things move forward that protect your interests for this or any other buyer.
I'd also, because I just saw something pop on the chat, and I've been on the school board for 10 years, but pretty much a lifelong Brighton member. I don't know a time when Brookside was tried to be sold. I don't think I said that grammatically correctly, just to be clear, but I don't remember a time when that ever came up. So if somebody has information on that, I'm interested, but in my 10 years, it's never come up.
Right, so I think there's been okay, so Aaron thinks it's about 30 years back.
I can offline put you in touch with somebody that would have better info, but
okay.
That was, I don't have specifics. I was told 27 or 30 years ago.
Right, and so I don't know, we none of us have any knowledge or recollection of that. We can.
Hello?
Kevin?
Kevin? It's Jody.
Siegel and Ruben Epstein, they will know.
Yes.
Jody will know. Jody is the resource, the archivist. Jody, how are you? And Ruben, how are you? What's the story?
I'm fine. And what happened was, and this was before I was on the Board of Education, there was an approach made to the board by Max Farish, who owns some of the land north of Brookside. And he wanted to make a swap with the district for land, to have more land close to the road. And he would give us some of the land further back. However, it wasn't a legal swap. The community was outraged that this was being discussed without public information. It really was a degree of lack of due diligence and public information that would be very shocking by modern standards. There was a large public meeting, and one of the things the school district would get in exchange was there was a willingness to build the bridge from Winton Road so that there'd be easier access into that property, both for him to have for his property and the school district. And Frank Scary Mamano, Martha Scary Mamano's husband, stood up at that meeting and explained that when Winton Road had been rebuilt several years before, they had to replace that bridge. And it was a one-lane bridge going into Brookside. And the law requires that the bridge be replaced the way it was. So they had to build a one-way bridge, but at the same time, they put in footings for a two-lane bridge. It was just covered up with one lane. And it became apparent that the school district and the town would be able to get a two-lane bridge without having to do any land swap at all. All they had to do was widen the bridge. And that was the end of it. But there was a lot of controversy because it was a situation where the board was negotiating to swap land with a private entity, and that just wasn't possible.
Thank you, Jody. So for those of you who don't know, but probably most of you do, Jody is a longtime school board member here in Brighton, executive director of Monroe County School Boards previously, and continues to lead the Brighton Education Fund. And we would never get a voting machine open in the past without Ruben, who's also always been a great friend of the district. So thanks for chiming in, Jody. Really appreciate that too.
You're welcome.
Other questions we can answer? Or feedback?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jody, for that history. That's always fun to get some of the people who've been around for these things to speak to this. And I think, was it Mark that was just answering some of my question or concern about the potential buyers and the agreement for right of first refusal? I do agree that we have a strong many strong boards in our community, but I also think hearing from some of my neighbors and even my own concern, looking at the reality of, other school campuses that have, I shouldn't say campuses, the one other school campus I'm aware of that was sold by Brighton School District in the past, belonging to Hillel School currently. And this is a bit hearsay, but I've heard that public access to that property is not allowed, or maybe not allowed at all times. And so I think that's some of the concern of the neighborhood now is, this is all in good faith, that this will remain as is, available open space to the community for use, but there's really no guarantee of that moving forward.
So, yeah, I can't speak to that specifically, other than my understanding is that Hillel is a very good neighbor, and that's been a good situation there. But I can't. Again, that's an understanding, but I can't speak to it more directly. I can say though that any school property contemplates issues during the school day, and this has been a discussion for us that's been very challenging at both French Road and Council Rock, relative to access to the property during the school day, the walking path that has run through the Council Rock property. And, we contemplate supervision during that time, et cetera. So I don't know what the variables there are during the school day, but that is always a consideration that any property considers, and frankly, would likely be considered at Brookside over time also, and probably is thought about by the Montessori program and others relative to safety and supervision. It's just a variable that you do consider. It would seem to me, being around the neighborhood around Hillel at different times, that access at other times is not it does not seem to me that it is prohibited or that there's any type of barrier to that. In other words, it's an open campus similar to all of our facilities where people utilize them pretty freely. But I couldn't speak directly to Hillel with any degree of expertise.
Kevin,
Yes.
I have a question.
Please do.
Currently, the Talmudic Institute is a residential school. So in moving into Brookside, is the plan that they would be a residential school in Brookside?
So we do not understand that to be the plan at all, and that's not been communicated. However, and I can't speak with expertise to this, but I will say that somebody did answer, a community member did answer who has familiarity, who's on the board of the school. Somebody is just unmuted, so it interrupts the audio. So if anybody could just check their mute, that'd be great. Hold on 1 second. All right. It's just some audio feedback. I don't believe that's a plan. In fact, the residential nature of the school is not at the school itself. And so I don't think that there is a plan for that. And I believe also that would require zoning consideration as well. I don't believe the property would be zoned properly for that. Not an expert in that by any means. But again, having read several comments from a person who would know on Facebook, that's not the residential nature of it. Means residential here, people coming from out of town, but not at the facility itself. Other questions, feedback, anything else I can answer?
This is Larry Powell. I appreciate all of the information that has been provided this evening. To follow up on a couple of the questions that were raised before, rather than rely on the zoning that is currently in place and the board members that are lifelong residents and have dedicated themselves to the community, and the goodwill of the potential purchaser to act as we hope that they will in the future, why not set forth in the conveyance deed certain conditions that will ensure that the issues don't become issues potentially in the future? For example, in the conveyance deed, provide that the school will be used for the substantial purpose that it currently is, which is a day school, not a residence. First time I've heard about the school itself potentially being a residential school. You could provide in there that wouldn't be the case. You could also provide for the right of first refusal, where the town or the school district could purchase the property back. And I realize you indicated that the property couldn't be set, the value at a set sum for the future, but we would be talking about property that would be zoned as and maintained as a school, basically. So the market value shouldn't fluctuate that greatly, I wouldn't think. Are there situations in place now currently to provide for any type of protection in the way of deed restrictions or covenants that will run with the land versus relying on the goodwill of successive purchasers?
Larry, I think the feedback is important. I also think the question is very fair, but not able to be answered relative to detail in the midst of a transaction. But we hear what you're saying, and I think that's good feedback for us to consider in the process.
Well, again, I do appreciate the honesty, and I understand that in the midst of an actual transaction that obviously you can't get too far into the weeds, but you've approached the community with information of the sale of the property, but the actual details of the sale, we've been asked to more or less take on faith. Whereas if the purchaser is intending to use the property for a set purpose, I would think that they would have no problem divulging or accepting in a conveyance deed that they will not only intend to use it for that purpose, but they actually would use it for that purpose. And they would have no problem with that being made public versus purchasing the property free and clear of all encumbrances from the town or the school board, and then them coming forward after the fact to make themselves endear to the community and potentially at that point start to clamp down on what they see as no longer access that they want to allow to the community. So again, I realize that you're somewhat hamstrung, but there is a certain level of transparency that I believe would be not only available, but to a purchaser that has the intent to which you ascribe, they would be willing to not only set it forth, but boldly set forth that this is what we intend to do, and we're happy to put it in writing.
That's a fair point, Larry. Thank you for sharing that. I would say, and it's I think sometimes just important to point out the relationship too, in the sense that we talk about this quite a bit, and some of us engaged in these conversations about how schools work and the governance and the dynamics of schools. It's just an interesting academic exercise, but plays out in reality that the district is on a day-to-day basis managed and led and run by an administrative staff. But we really value the fact that as a public institution, the way schools work and have worked in our country since, frankly, the Common School movement and one-house schools and school committees and in colonies, there's an oversight from community members that are elected to act on behalf of community members, right? So in volunteer positions, these 7 people are elected by you to act in your best interest and to be privy to all of the detailed information that perhaps can't be released publicly, but can be discussed privately on your behalf and represent your interest to the best of their ability. So I know that's acting for a leap of faith, particularly at a time when leaps of faith in government are hard to make and hard to find. But I can assure you that we can't, because of the way the rules work and the balance happens, as a district act without board approval, and likewise, the board doesn't act without recommendation. So there's a check and a balance to that, and an opportunity for your voice to be heard tonight with those board members present, but then to be expressed on your behalf, and they have access to that information as well. So I think you bring up some really good points, and I appreciate you doing that.
To that point, Kevin, I think that goes back to some of the discussion at the beginning of the meeting about the community information available. This would have been a really important matter to be discussing as a community prior to the board elections, so that the community was really aware of the people that they were putting in these positions to make the decisions on their behalf. Unfortunately, that wasn't what occurred. And so the community does have to trust the people that they've put into this position. But again, I think I included this in my email with you, knowing that the community has voiced concerns in the past. If anything, the board should be looking at that as the inference of how to progress. And I get the financial implications of what we've discussed tonight and wanting to be responsible financially for the community as well. But I think what you just brought up kind of reiterates the point of the concern of the community that we want to be represented. And I guess that transitions to a specific question. I know I've discussed this specifically with you by email. The community has the right to request a vote on this matter. By educational law, that would require 10% of a debated number of the community. And I would love to get an exact response from you, or a date when the community might be aware of what that exact number is. Some debate was if that is 10% of the potential voting community or 10% of the actual voting community related to the number of total voters from the last budget vote, which was, I think, 2,160. So that would be approximately 217 people for 10%, which is related to the educational board voting to sell real estate. And the number you referenced was much higher at 2,600 voters, being 10% of the estimated total, what did you call it, potential voter population, which really is, in my estimation, quite impossible to nail down. But I think that's important for the community to know if they want to be able to speak to this and want to petition to have a vote and have their voice heard. If they differ from the board's current direction, what is that number they need to achieve?
Right, so I will add that to the FAQ document that we published, Kay, and it's a good question, just to make sure we're clear on it for everybody listening and for the recording. Kay's question is that there is an option for the community through a petition process to request a vote, a community vote on the sale of the property, as opposed to the board action, which is the option of the board. The community could present that petition, and the question is how many signatures would have to be on that petition to compel a vote. And Kay's presented the idea that at 2,160 approximate voters in the last budget vote, that it would be 10% of that total number, which would be similar to how petitions for running for the board are calculated based on the total number of previous voters. The law does not prescribe that it is by that manner, and in our attorney's advice initially, our understanding is that it is of eligible voters in the community, which would be a much higher number and could be based on voter registration. We don't, as a school district, register voters, but voter registration and voter registration rules are available for the community. So we'll explore that further and make sure that we're providing the absolute perfect answer. If there's any question, we'll redouble that with our attorneys and include that in the FAQ that we plan on publishing. We're sending out tomorrow, so hopefully that answer can be, we can make sure that that's entirely accurate. We don't want to give the wrong answer. There's no motivation to do that.
I appreciate that, Kevin. And I think it is important for the community to note that that standard between the 217 versus the 2,600 is a very big difference. And actually knowing that the 2,600 is almost 120% of the turnout for the last vote of, the 2,100 plus voters, that would be a little bit, in my estimation, absurd in a way to request that many people on a petition, making it virtually impossible for the community to actually voice a concern in that way.
Thanks. We'll get that feedback out. Any other final thoughts, questions, or comments that we can answer at this point? So we're going to put out a recording of this, an updated frequently asked question with anything else that came up tonight that wasn't answered. And I'm trying to think if there was another, the map. Lou was also going to be able to post a copy of the map. And we appreciate everybody asking for feedback, and continue to send us your questions, and we'll answer them to the best of our ability, and certainly contemplate what we've heard tonight as well.
Yeah, I would just say thanks to my neighbors for showing up and providing feedback. Some of these conversations aren't easy, but we need to hear everything. And again, just a brief shout out to Aaron for sort of taking on a multi-scribe communicator, point of contact sort of role on behalf of the neighborhood. Thank you for that.
And one quick add too, and a clarification. Again, thank you to everybody for joining in. And again, you are all welcome. A number of you have written us quite frequently, and you're welcome to continue to do that, either individually or to the whole board. We do meet in the summer. Someone mentioned a hiatus. We actually have a July 1 meeting. There's a July 1 board meeting, and then there's an August board meeting. So there is additional business that goes on during the summer. But you feel free to contact directly to Dr. McGowan or the 7 board members. We will continue to answer questions, post information online, and attempt to answer everything that we possibly can as soon as we are able. So thank you very much.
Kind of a bummer. I actually thought we had a hiatus when somebody said that, and I thought I didn't know something. So, okay.
We'll see you at the meetings. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much again for participating. We appreciate it, and we'll be sending out all that material tomorrow. Take care.
Thank you.
This has been a special presentation from the Brighton Central School District.